Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. This is going to be more of a conceptual video, just kind of breaking down back-end frameworks at a conceptual level. Because once you understand sort of the overarching what it's doing and what are the different pieces, it's going to make it a lot easier to learn really any back-end framework. Whether you're learning Ruby on Rails, in Ruby, you're learning full TS, FOAL-TS in JavaScript, whether you are learning Django in Python, or Buffalo and Go. These are sort of the big ones in each. This will kind of give you the idea. So bottom line is this. Everything kind of revolves, in the backend revolves around a server doing stuff before the client receives it. So let's draw just the basic sort of how the internet works kind of picture. Okay? So this is a server. Okay? Make this expand a little bit. Maybe I should just do it from over here. No, I don't want to rotate it. Okay, it's fine. Okay, so there's a server. Let's duplicate that. And then here's the client. Oops, I deleted it. Not quite as smooth in LibreOffice Impress as I am in PowerPoint, but you know, you guys get the idea. Okay, so there's the client. So essentially what happens is that the client's using a browser like Chrome or Firefox, and what they're going to do, and let me just move this over a little bit more to the side, they're going to send out a request. Let me find the right kind of arrow. So this is a request, and that's going to end up going to the DNS system. Okay, so every domain has a DNS entry somewhere on some DNS server. That's why when you're like registering a domain on GoDaddy or whatnot, it matters where your DNS servers are. Because basically what happens is in the registry, think of a DNS, stands for domain name service, is kind of like a phone book. That's telling, well, you have a request for this domain, where's that domain located? Okay? So that request, we say, hey, I want to go to xyz.com, a DNS, where do I go? And then that's going to tell you, oh, okay, really, you know, that website is really hosted on this server at this IP address, and send the request over there. Okay. Then the server is going to do stuff. That's the backend. So anything that happens between this request coming into the server, the computer that hosts the website, versus versus its response that it sends back, that's backend. So this part over here. Okay, once the response is made, anything that happens after the response is made is client side or front end. So this is what's the difference between sort of like what React is doing. Because what happens is that the server will send the website that includes all the stuff that React, Angular, Vue does, but all that stuff really gets processed by the browser here in the front end. So when you understand this process, you start understanding what's going on. Okay, so the server is going to be running software. Okay, usually at minimum you're running what's called Apache or Nginx. This is your web server. Okay, and what the web server really does is, by default, as I understand it, it's all internet traffic is going to go to port 80 if it's HTTP, and I think it's port 433. It might not be the exact number, but somewhere in the 400s if it's HTTPS, meaning it's over it has an SSL certificate, it's a secure URL. But the thing is that there might be like 100 different websites on this server. So how does it know when traffic comes in at port 80 or port 433 what website to respond with? Okay, so this is what Apache and Nginx do. They'll say, okay, you're looking for this particular website with this particular URL. Those files are over here. Those files for this one's over here. They're kind of like that traffic controller, and they generally have things like PHP built in. So generally, Apache is kind of already able to handle things like PHP, which is why PHP is, because that was what's been around for a long time. You know, a lot of things like Node.js and a lot of these other what we use server side nowadays didn't come around until later. So oftentimes configuring Apache or Nginx to do something in Python or Node or whatnot requires a little extra configuration. But that's why you have places like Heroku and Python Anywhere that take that trouble away from you. Okay, so that's what like Apache and Nginx do. Okay, so let's actually put them on the board. Okay. So that's really your web server. There's other ones, but those are sort of the two big ones. But if you're using something sort of, if you're using some sort of framework, what's going to probably have its own sort of web server built in. So if you're using Node, usually you spin up your own web server from within Node or from within Go or within whatever language you're using. Okay, and that's going to be generally the core thing that any web backend web framework does. Okay, so this is basically creating another sort of server for that particular application. So Apache Nginx will say, hey, we have all these applications on our server, which one do you need to get to? They send it to the application, then that application will have its own server that'll handle requests going to that particular application. And then that's referred to as routing. So saying there, oh, you want to go to xyz.com/cheese? Okay, this is what we're supposed to do if you ask for that. Okay, so basically the minimum that a web framework is going to do is going to be spinning up that server and providing routing, meaning directing within that application what resources get sent back. Okay, so if you're using like Express, Koa on JavaScript, those are very minimalist frameworks, which they pretty much only do server routing. Everything else you'd bring in other libraries. Or on Go, there's Mux, which pretty much just does routing. If you are on Python, there is Django. Not Django. Flask, that pretty much just does that core functionality, and you bring in other stuff as you need it. Okay. Cool. So those are sort of like those minimalist frameworks. There's other ones in different languages. Unfortunately, I don't know every framework in every language. I do know quite a few of them though. Okay, but now as you start getting to less or more robust frameworks, they're going to start bringing in a lot of the stuff that you would normally bring in other libraries, and then you have to learn that library and configure the two things together and make it all work together. There's other frameworks that sit there and say, hey, you know what? We're going to bring in those libraries for you, and we're going to configure everything for you, so that way you just have this one sort of working environment. Okay, so this is the more robust frameworks for each language. So if we're talking about JavaScript, that would be like FOALTS or Adonis. Those are more robust frameworks that are going to provide you sort of a full development experience. Okay, and what kind of extra things are they providing? So if you're talking about Python, that's Django. If you're talking about Go, that's Buffalo. If you're talking about Ruby, we're talking about Ruby on Rails. These are sort of those more robust frameworks. Okay. And they're going to provide other things, such as authentication. And authentication takes on several different layers. So it's keeping track of who your users are. And once a user logs in, creating cookies for what's called session. So what's going to happen is that it will keep track of, oh, this user has logged in. We're going to put a cookie on their computer that the server will recognize, that allows know that they're already logged in. So that way they don't have to keep logging in and again and again. That may expire at some point. But the thing is that server has to keep track of that session. So there's actually like a copy of that session on the server, and then when you go to the website, they check in to say, hey, is there already an active session for this computer? Which is fine, but that means they have to keep checking in with the server. Okay, there are other ways you can do this. So this is where nowadays they use something called like a Json Web Token, a JWT, where you can actually have this sort of code that's unique, and you may not necessarily have to be checking with the server every single time to see if that session exists. There's different ways of doing it, but the idea is like the basic idea behind authentication is, once the user logs in, how do we keep track that they're still logged in, whether it be by cookies, whether you're using local storage. Probably cookies and local storage on the person's computer isn't the most secure way of doing it. So you may want them to keep checking in with the API and doing those requests just for security purposes, but you can do it by using, you know, a traditional session or a JWT, but that kind of thing is built into the framework. Or you bring it in if you're talking about a minimalist framework. Okay, then we have database, ORM. Okay, so basically you're going to want to store data because generally most applications you're going to want the user to be able to manipulate data, retrieve data, and you're going to want to have it stored somewhere. You could have it stored in your code, but that means it can't be changed. Okay, or once a server restarts, all that information is back to its original state. You're not saving. You can't mutate the code files. Okay, so if you want mutable data that can change, you're going to need a database, which could either be a NoSQL database like Mongo, Scilla, or DynamoDB, or you can use an SQL database like a MariaDB, MySQL, SQLite, PostgreSQL, all these different databases. What's the big difference between like SQL and NoSQL? The difference is SQL keeps track of relationships between data. So basically when you're defining your different data types, you actually define like, well, you know, this picture is attached to a individual user. You start defining all these different types of relationships, and the database will kind of manage that and allow you to be able to query it that way. While a NoSQL database is generally what's called a flat file database, which means it's just text. You're just taking information in, and any kind of interactivity with that data, any kind of relationship with that data isn't in the database. You have to go figure that out in your software. Nowadays, with things like GraphQL, the difference bleeds a little bit, because with GraphQL you can define relationships between any kind of data, but I'll get back to that in a bit. But the thing is that your server needs to be able to reach out to that database, because that database is a whole separate thing. It's like a separate database server that might be on that server or on a different server. So your application needs to know how to reach that database, how to add and subtract data from that database. So you're going to need some sort of database library. So if we're talking about like a Mongo database, or you're going to use something like Mongoose on JavaScript, that'll connect to your Mongo database wherever it is and give you the ability to add and subtract information. Generally for an SQL database, most programming languages have some sort of libraries called an ORM, an Object Relationship Manager. What this is going to do is the same thing. It helps you connect to the database and put stuff in and out of the database. But, you know, when you go to like Ruby on Rails, Django, Buffalo, they generally have an Laravel for PHP. They already have the ORM built in. Okay, so basically you have everything you need to kind of really kickstart your application when you have these more robust frameworks. So you can authenticate your users. And the last piece, actually I'll just copy and paste this. Is rendering. Cool. So now what rendering is taking all this information from your database that you need, making sure that, so basically once we know that the user is logged in and A-OK, we're going to say, hey, and so the server, so basically you might have something on your route saying, okay, well, if you go to xyz.com/cheese, first, we're going to send them to this resource, but before we send anything back, we're going to check that they're authenticated. And once we know that they're authenticated, we're going to pull certain data from the database and we're going to render it into a web page that we're going to send back. You don't have to send the web page back. You don't have to send HTML, CSS, and JavaScript back. You can just send like a string, whatever back. Okay, a response is just a response, and you include what you want in the response. But you might render HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and you want, you know, you don't want it to be static in the sense that, hey, it's the same thing for everybody. You want to say, hey, I want this user's photos. I want this user's blog post to be on this web page. So that's what the server-side rendering does. It's going to go in there, pull the image from the database, plop them into a template, and then assemble the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, and it's sent back via response that then the client browser renders onto the browser screen. Cool. And most frameworks generally have some sort of templating language built in. Jinja for Python. In JavaScript, there's a dozen different templating languages, etc. But they allow you to basically create a template of the HTML file and where the different data is going to be plopped in. Now, that was sort of how things were mostly done. So basically what would happen is that every time you'd go to a different page on the same website, a new request would get in, the database would have to pull information out again, and then would have to render the next page and send it back. But if you're rendering each page and you're making the server do this work for every individual page on the website, that becomes, one, you're putting your server through much more work, which means it's harder to scale. Also, it slows down the user experience because they got to wait for this whole process to happen every time they click on a link. So what's happened over time is they develop what's called a single page application. So Control C, Control V. And what the single page application is basically, instead of sending in like a JavaScript, HTML, CSS that represents one individual page, what you do instead is you're going to send an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that represents the whole application. So instead of having like multiple HTML files, it's really just like one file that mutates based on what the user is doing based on JavaScript that's built in. So it's very JavaScript heavy, because instead of going to a new file, you're just operating within one. But it feels like a lot of pages. The benefit of this is that the server only has to render the page once. Okay, so the server just sends over. So the server would just send over the application as a response, and then the client would just, you know, basically render that single page application once, and they can browse the whole website. And when they need individual pieces of data, they would send that back. So then what would happen is that you would actually sever the two in this case. So basically, what would happen is that you would do something more like this. You would have a single page application it's hosted in one place. So we'll do that. Then we're going to rotate it. Okay, so basically the client's really going to go call the SPA from whatever server. Okay, because the single page application is really just one static application that has all these. And then what the single page application does is then individually make requests. Let's see. Is there? Yeah, I guess we'll just do it this way. Oh, no. That's not the one I wanted. I want this. We'll make application. We'll make response. We'll make its own request to the backend via API, so API calls. So nowadays what happens is that you don't really do this rendering part. So this rendering part doesn't happen on the server anymore because you're causing the server to do too much too often. So instead what happens is you'll have one application that has this sort of statically built single page application that does have certain information that it needs to pull. And then what it does, it calls onto the separate server that instead delivers information via an API. So instead of sending back a full HTML website, it's sending back usually what's called JSON data. Okay, so basically respond with JSON. Okay, which is just basically strings. So it's going to say send back the information that the user wants, and then the website, the code will actually render it and put it into the website at this point. So it's in the client side. That's why it's called front-end web development when you're talking about React, Vue, Angular, because technically, instead of putting the information in the template over here before we send it back, we're sending back the single page application, and the application pulls in the data it needs when it needs it through little mini calls to the API, which overall means much less work for the server, because even though they're sending back data, sending back a little piece of data every once in a while, it's a lot better than having to re-render the whole page every time they click a link. Problem is, there are benefits to rendering server side. Okay? such as being able to take advantage of like URL parameters. So you actually can put variables in the URL, or putting in query parameters and doing all sorts of other kind of really neat things that you can't do if the application's solely over here. Okay, so now what's happened, you have server-side rendering frameworks over here. So this is, so we'll say SSR, okay, and this is like Next, Nux, Nest, and what these do is that you're still going to send back the single page application back to the user, so you still have that experience, but it is going to do some level of rendering on the server side, some dynamic templating. But then what it sends back is the single page application. So you still have the benefit of this one application, but we're going to have a little bit of rendering happen up front when they do that initial request. So you send in the URL, it takes a look at the URL, it might grab a parameter, do some stuff, assemble the application, send it back to the user, and then the user is fine until they need to make another request. So, you know, everything is kind of slowly evolving, because every time we develop sort of a new way of doing things, there's certain things about the old way that we miss, so we got to find a better way to bring them back. So this is like the server-side rendering trend we're seeing with like every front-end framework. So Vue, Angular, Svelte, Stencil, React all have their server-side libraries or frameworks that allow you to do a little bit of server-side rendering before you send them over to the front end. But again, back-end, front-end. Last trend I'm going to talk about before I wrap up this video, because it's getting kind of long, is the new trend of static site generators. So what a static site generator is what if you just kind of cut out all of this, okay? Say, hey, we don't need a database, we don't need authentication, we don't need any of this. We're just gonna have a static website, literally just a static page, which means everything is literally hard-coded. It's just an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript with pretty much everything already boiled in. So there's no having to reach to a database. Why? Because it does that before you actually deploy it. So what happens is that you use, these are referred to as static site generators. So the way this would work is that it's kind of outside of this whole process. So SSG, static site generators, this is like Gatsby, Hugo, Jekyll. You would build out this website using Gatsby, Hugo, or Jekyll, and then you would just click a button, and then Gatsby, Hugo, or Jekyll would build out the whole website on your computer, and then you would just go upload it to like a Netlify or some other web host statically. Okay, so bloop, done. The benefit from the user standpoint is it's faster because there's less dynamic things going on. All the data is already built into the website, so there's no need to be waiting for API calls or much in the way of asynchronous action, meaning not things happening parallel to each other but at different times. On top of it, since it's static, it's going to be easier for search engines to read. There's a lot of cool benefits. Okay? And then every time you make an update, you just recompile the website and then redeploy it. Kind of like what we used to do in the old days, except using this like generator, you cut out a lot of the work. Because back in the old days, you'd have to edit every HTML and CSS and JavaScript file and build it all out together. This will generate all the files for you. So you have an old school static website, but it feels like you're working in a sort of more modern way because you have the generator in the middle. And you get all the benefits of the speed and security and whatnot of having a static site. So you're still connecting to a database and doing all this stuff, but you're doing it before you even send out the website to be reviewed. You're generating the website first. So that's really cool. Okay. And then Netlify has created what's called Netlify CMS. What it does is that it creates like a visual backend for these static site generators. So that way a user can log in and build more sites. Because what a lot of these do is that instead of having a database with blog posts, what they'll do is that they'll let you create Markdown files. And if you've worked with if you don't know what a Markdown file is, it's just another way of creating files that can be visually broken down. And the benefit of that is you just add Markdown files. There's no need to call a separate database. So you would just add a separate Markdown file for every blog post you want. You would just recompile, regenerate the website and whatnot. So what Netlify CMS does, it can connect and create a backend for these Gatsby, Hugo, Jekyll, and other static site generators. Allows you to, in a visual way, kind of like you're working on WordPress, be able to write a new blog post. It'll generate the Markdown file, regenerate the website for you, and then you just have this, which allows you, especially if you're like a freelancer who's working with like small restaurants, whatnot, allows you to create a very lightweight, effective website that's easy for your client to manage. So this is like a really cool technology, especially when you're talking about that sort of, that mom and pop market, which is going to be most websites. Your local restaurants, your local lawyer, your local, who doesn't need kind of anything quite this complex, but they could use some functionality and some more modern speed and whatnot, okay? Versus like using a WordPress where everything is server-side rendered. So every time you click on a page, you have to wait for the WordPress server to do its thing. Although WordPress has also kind of built in its own API in the backend, so that way you can kind of do something like this with the benefits of this. So this kind of gives you, hopefully you kind of see how everything connects a little bit more. I kind of went beyond the backend. I kind of explained the whole thing, but this will certainly make understanding sort of how everything fits together a lot clearer. And hopefully you guys enjoy that, and this makes things a lot easier, because now when you learn it, you kind of see where everything is in the mix, and you can, and that just kind of helps put things in context. So have a great day and enjoy. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.